My father once said that some victories are clean on paper and complicated everywhere else. He mentioned a mission in the Pacific where the timing was flawless, the intelligence exact, the interception precise. But he said the argument started almost immediately. Years later, when I studied the mission reports, Japanese records, and later historical reviews, I found that the success was never in doubt. The debate was, I've listed the sources in the description below. The flight plan was perfect, the credit was not. Here is that story.
April 18th, 1943. A twin-engine bomber falls from the sky above Bougainville. It tears through the canopy and disappears into the jungle. Inside sits Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor. America celebrates. Intelligence triumphs. A legend is born. But within hours, 2 American pilots both claim the kill. A dispute ignites that will last longer than the war itself. Who really fired the fatal shots? To understand why the United States would commit 16 fighters, hundreds of gallons of irreplaceable fuel, and its most closely guarded intelligence secret to kill one man, you have to understand who that man was. Isoroku Yamamoto was born on April 4th, 1884, and would become the commander of the combined fleet of the Imperial Japanese Navy during World War II. His given name, Isoroku, meant 56 in Old Japanese, a reference to his father's age at his birth. He came from humble origins. He was the 7th son of a poor schoolteacher in a fishing village, named after his father's age, and his boyhood was hard, marked by scarce food, cold winters, and the rigors of school and labor. Yet there was an intensity in him that would not be contained. He decided to test for the Naval Academy, reasoning that if he failed, he would become a teacher like his father. He tested second out of 300 students and began a Spartan training regime that would propel him toward the highest ranks of Japanese naval command. He fought in the Russo-Japanese War. A veteran of Japan's crushing defeat of the Russian Navy in the Tsushima Strait in 1904, he was wounded in combat, losing 2 fingers and suffering abdominal scars from shrapnel. The scars never fully left him. Neither did the lessons. He studied at Harvard University from 1919 to 1921, and later served 2 postings as a naval attaché in Washington, where he learned to speak fluent English. He studied economics and petroleum sources, using his free time to tour oil fields in the United States and Mexico. He played poker obsessively. He read widely. He slept only a few hours each night. He studied America not as an enemy, but as a puzzle, absorbing its habits, its appetites, its terrifying industrial potential. Having spent years in the United States and fully aware of the nation's manpower and industrial might, he knew Imperial Japan could ill afford a protracted and attritional conflict. He said so openly. He said so often. And for this, he received death threats from ultranationalists in his own country. Yamamoto opposed the 1940 alliance with Nazi Germany, which he feared would drag Japan into a ruinous war. Well aware of the immense industrial capacity of the United States, Yamamoto asserted Japan's only chance for victory lay in a surprise attack that would cripple the American naval forces in the Pacific and force the United States into a negotiated peace. He did not want the war, but when it came, he planned the blow. Pearl Harbor was his design. On December 7, 1941, that design killed over 2,400 Americans and shattered the Pacific Fleet. For the American public, he became the face of Japanese aggression, the mind behind the day of infamy. The fact that he had privately warned against the conflict made no difference. He had struck. And in war, the man who strikes first becomes the target who must be struck last. Once considered a friend by many Americans, by 1943 he had become a symbol of Japanese militarism, hence a target of great importance. By early 1943, the tide in the Pacific had shifted. The early months of war had brought Japanese victories, but those gains were halted at the Battle of Midway in June 1942, where 4 Japanese carriers were sunk, and Yamamoto committed to the defense of the Solomon Islands in the Guadalcanal campaign, but was unable to prevent their capture. His fleet was bleeding. His aviators were dying faster than they could be trained. And yet he remained, in the eyes of both nations, the indispensable man. Removing him would not just weaken Japan's command structure, it would shatter something intangible, something closer to faith. Like and subscribe to support more true wartime intelligence stories. On April 14, 1943, the war's most dangerous secret arrived inside a coded message. On that date, multiple United States radio intercept sites copied a Japanese naval message encoded in the JN-25D cipher. Navy codebreakers in Washington and at Fleet Radio Unit Pacific at Pearl Harbor immediately set to work trying to break the message. The effort that intercepted it was part of a massive and ongoing intelligence operation. American codebreakers had been able to decipher Japanese naval code messages, unbeknownst to the enemy, and this capability had already made a critical difference at the Battle of Midway. The system was codenamed Magic. It was among the most closely guarded advantages the Allies possessed. If the Japanese ever discovered their codes were compromised, they would change them overnight, and the war would get harder in ways no battlefield commander wanted to imagine. The intercepted note concerned a planned inspection by Yamamoto in the Solomon Islands. The message contained many details, like departure times, locations, exact route, even the number and types of aircraft assigned to his flight. The message contained a down-to-the-minute timetable for a trip Yamamoto would be taking on April 18th. The trip was scheduled to bring him from Rabaul to the Shortland Islands just south of Bougainville. These were the Japanese most forward areas, and therefore the closest Yamamoto would ever be to American forces. The intelligence was extraordinary. It was also terrifying, because acting on it meant risking everything. Nimitz and his intelligence officer Leighton debated at length the pros and cons of the intercept mission. On one hand, killing Yamamoto would tip off the Japanese that their codes had been broken. The risk was not theoretical. If the Japanese changed JN-25, the Allies would lose their window into enemy operations across the entire Pacific theater. Every convoy route, every fleet movement, every planned offensive would go dark. But against that risk stood an opportunity that might never come again. Yamamoto would be at the far edge of his own territory, flying in a slow transport bomber on a schedule precise to the minute. His famous punctuality, the trait that made him an effective commander, now made him a target. The information immediately went from Admiral Nimitz to Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox, who delivered the news to President Franklin Roosevelt. The response from Washington was unambiguous. The order filtered back down the chain, through Nimitz, through Halsey, through Mitchell. Get him. Nimitz signed off on an operation to shoot Yamamoto out of the sky and asked Admiral Halsey to design and execute the mission. Admiral Mitchell was then tasked by Halsey to orchestrate the strike. The clock was ticking. The message indicated the trip would take place roughly 72 hours after it was sent. By the time the intelligence reached key commanders, only about 64 hours remained. To protect the code-breaking secret, a cover story was prepared. American news agencies would later be given a story that civilian coast watchers in the Solomons had observed Yamamoto boarding a bomber and relayed the information by radio to American naval forces. Halsey and Mitchell even started planning additional long-range P-38 raids in the days following the mission to sell the idea that the Yamamoto intercept was just a lucky stroke among routine raids, all designed to protect the code-breaking secret. But the pilots themselves knew almost nothing. They were told only that they would be intercepting a high-ranking officer. The full truth of what they were doing, and why, could not survive exposure to daylight. The mission had a name: Operation Vengeance, and the cost of failure was measured not in planes, but in years of intelligence advantage. The mission required a kind of flying that verged on the impossible. Navy and Marine Corps fighters like the F-4F Wildcat and F-4U Corsair did not have the range to travel the estimated 435 miles to the planned interception point. The only fighters capable of that range were the Army Air Force's P-38 Lightnings. This twin-boom fighter was known for its ability to climb and packed a powerful punch with 4 50-caliber machine guns and a 20-millimeter cannon. But range alone did not solve the problem. A straight flight to the intercept point would carry the P-38s over Japanese-held islands bristling with radar and observation posts. The intercept point, just west of Bougainville, was 400 miles from the Lightning's airfield. An additional 200 miles would have to be added to avoid Japanese radar and observation posts. Even with a direct flight path home, the total round-trip distance of 1,000 miles would cut dangerously close to the P-38's maximum range, even with drop tanks. The math was brutal. Every gallon of fuel mattered. Every minute of combat would burn through reserves that could not be replaced in the air. Time for maneuvering and fighting over Bougainville would have to be no more than 10 minutes, a fact that greatly reduced the chances of success. The mission was headed by Major John W. Mitchell, using 18 P-38s from the 12th, 339th, and 70th Fighter Squadrons. To make the journey, the planes were fitted with 2 external fuel tanks to extend their range. 2 aircraft would serve as spares. 4 were designated as the kill flight. The rest would provide top cover, engaging any enemy fighters that rose to defend Yamamoto. The killer flight of 4 fighters was led by Captain Thomas G. Lanphier. They would attack the 2 Betty bombers containing Yamamoto and his staff. The other pilots in the kill flight included First Lieutenant Rex T. Barber as Lanphier's wingman, First Lieutenant Besby Holmes, and First Lieutenant Raymond Hine. On the evening of April 17th, the pilots were briefed. They learned only what they needed to know: a high-value target, a precise schedule, a window measured in minutes. Major Mitchell was ordered to report to the operations dugout at Henderson Field on Guadalcanal. The weight of what he was told settled slowly. This was not a sweep. This was not a patrol. This was a directed kill. The morning of April 18th came early. It was Palm Sunday. Since there were no religious holidays on Guadalcanal, they took off at 7:15 in the morning, joined in formation, and left the island at 7:30, just 2 hours and 5 minutes before the planned interception. 2 of the original aircraft experienced mechanical trouble and had to abort. 16 P-38s pressed on. They flew low, dangerously, exhaustingly low. It was an uneventful flight, but a hot one, at 10 to 50 feet above the water all the way. Some of the pilots counted sharks. One counted pieces of driftwood. The roar of twin Allison engines filled their cockpits, and the salt spray was close enough to taste. There was no radio contact, no chatter, no navigation aids. Mitchell kept them on course, flying the 5 compass legs by time and airspeed only. Dead reckoning across 400 miles of open Pacific. If he was off by a few degrees, they would miss the intercept entirely. If Yamamoto was late or early or flew a different route, everything would unravel. Mitchell figured the odds of merely spotting Yamamoto's flight at 1,000 to 1. The Pacific stretched out beneath them. Empty. Blue. Enormous. Each pilot sat alone in his cockpit, watching the water, watching the instruments, watching the fuel gauge. The silence was enormous, and the waiting was worse. The coastline of Bougainville appeared as a dark seam against the horizon. 2 hours of water-level flying were ending. The intercept point was minutes away. And then the most improbable thing happened. As they turned into the coast of Bougainville and started to gain altitude, after more than 2 hours of complete radio silence, First Lieutenant Douglas Canning, the one they called Old Eagle Eyes, spotted them first. The contact was visual. 2 aircraft, low, heading southeast toward Balalai. The P-38s encountered 2 bombers and 6 escorts, not 1 bomber and escorts as expected. Unsure which carried Yamamoto, they had to attempt to destroy both. The timing was almost supernatural. Mitchell had calculated the intercept for 9:35 in the morning. The Japanese aircraft appeared within a minute of that prediction. After a 1,000-to-1 bet across 400 miles of featureless ocean, using nothing but a compass and a watch, the Americans had arrived at precisely the right place at precisely the right time. The navigation was flawless. But there was a complication. The kill flight was supposed to have 4 aircraft. Holmes, the leader of the second element, could not release his belly tanks, so in an effort to jar them loose, he turned off down the coast, kicking his plane around to knock the tanks free. Hine, his wingman, had no choice but to follow to protect him. So Lanphier and Barber were the only 2 going after the Japanese for the first few minutes. 2 P-38s against 2 bombers and 6 Zeros. The arithmetic was poor, but there was no time for arithmetic. The P-38s had flown low, in radio silence, changing course several times to avoid flying over Japanese island bases. When they approached Bougainville, 12 of them climbed to provide top cover for the 4-plane attack flight. The cover section rose to 18,000 feet, watching for the swarm of Zeros that everyone expected from the nearby airfield at Kahili, where dozens of enemy fighters were based. Below them, Lanphier and Barber pushed their throttles forward and dove toward the bombers. The Japanese escort pilots saw them coming. When the P-38s were about a mile in front of the bombers, the escorting Zeros spotted them and dropped their own external fuel tanks to prepare for battle. The bombers began descending. The Zeros turned to engage. In these seconds, the entire mission compressed into a violent geometry of altitude, speed, and angle. 2 Americans, 2 targets, 6 defenders, and a jungle canopy waiting below like a green floor. What happened next would take less than a minute, but it would be argued about for the next 60 years. The engagement was fast, savage, disorienting. Lanphier and Barber broke toward the Japanese formation. The Zeros dropped from their escort positions and turned to intercept. According to Lanphier's later account, he pulled up and engaged the escort fighters, scattering them with a burst of fire. Lanphier claimed in his report that after turning to engage the escort Zeros and shooting the wings off one, he had flipped upside down as he circled back toward the 2 bombers. Upon seeing the lead bomber turning below him, he came out of his turn at a right angle to the circling bomber and fired, blowing off its right wing. The plane then crashed into the jungle. But that was one version of events. Barber's account was different. Barber's account was that he shot down Yamamoto's bomber, attacking it from the rear. The plane was burning, but the wings were still attached when it hit the jungle. When Barber hit its left engine, the bomber began to trail heavy black smoke. The Betty rolled violently to the left, and Barber narrowly avoided a mid-air collision. Looking back, he saw a column of black smoke and assumed the Betty had crashed into the jungle. 1 bomber was down. Its column of smoke rose above the canopy, visible for miles. Barber headed toward the coast at treetop level, searching for the 2nd bomber, not knowing which one carried the targeted high-ranking officer. He spotted the 2nd bomber, carrying Vice Admiral Ugaki and part of Yamamoto's staff, low over the water off Moila Point, trying to evade an attack by Holmes, whose wing tanks had finally come off. Holmes damaged the right engine of the Betty. Barber attacked the crippled bomber, and his bullet strikes caused it to shed metal debris that damaged his own aircraft. The second bomber went into the sea. Vice Admiral Ugaki survived the attack and was rescued later. Running close to minimum fuel levels for the return to base, the P-38s broke off contact, with Holmes so short of fuel that he was forced to land in the Russell Islands. Lieutenant Hine was the only American pilot who did not return. The mission was over. Both bombers were destroyed. One American was lost. Despite the inexplicable loss of P-38 pilot Raymond Hine, all other members of the flight returned to base. But for days, the Americans did not know if Yamamoto was truly dead. The Japanese did not release word of Yamamoto's death, even to their own public, until May 21, 1943. It was not until this release that the Americans had absolute confirmation of the mission's results. What they did know, as they landed and shut down their engines, was that they had pulled off something extraordinary. They had flown 1,000 miles round trip, arrived within seconds of the calculated intercept, engaged and destroyed both targets, and returned with only one loss. In the calculus of war, it was near perfect execution. But perfection, as it turned out, was fragile, and the cracks were already forming before the propellers stopped spinning. The debriefing began almost as soon as the engines cooled. At Henderson Field, the pilots gathered to report what they had seen and done. In the chaotic, adrenaline-soaked aftermath of aerial combat, this was normal procedure. Each man described his actions. Each man described his targets. And it was here, in the dust and heat of Guadalcanal, that the first fissure appeared. As Lanphier approached Henderson Field, he radioed the fighter director on Guadalcanal a boastful message about the mission's target, breaching security and endangering the code-breaking program. Upon landing, one engine quit from fuel starvation. He immediately put in a claim for shooting down Yamamoto. His confidence was total. His narrative was vivid. He had engaged the Zeros. He had turned back. He had fired across the bomber's flight path. The wing had come off. The plane had gone into the jungle. That was his version, delivered with the conviction of a man who believed every word. Arriving at base, Lanphier, Barber, and Holmes all claimed to have shot at Betty bombers on the mission. Lanphier claimed to have shot down one that crashed on the island. Holmes claimed to have shot down one that crashed in the sea near the island. Barber claimed to have shot at both bombers before they went down. Apparently, they had no gun camera footage to bolster their claims. The gun cameras had reportedly been left at Guadalcanal to save weight on the extremely long interception mission. Without film, there was only testimony. Lanphier's account was the most assertive. He told it quickly, firmly, and publicly. He spoke when the mission demanded silence. He claimed credit when the operation demanded secrecy. Fellow pilot Roger Ames recalled hearing Lanphier break radio silence on the return flight with a triumphant remark about the target, something that deeply upset other pilots because they had been ordered to keep complete silence about the fact that they had gone after Yamamoto. The details of the mission were not supposed to leave the island. Yet the claim took hold. Lanphier was articulate. He was well-connected. His father was a prominent military figure. He moved in circles where stories could be amplified and reputations built. His version of the attack became the first version committed to official reports. And in the military, the first account written down often becomes the hardest to erase. The issue began immediately after the mission, when the United States military credited Captain Lanphier with the kill. The early momentum was entirely in his favor. His name attached itself to the mission like a caption to a photograph. Lanphier shot down Yamamoto. That was the story. Clean. Simple. Heroic. But not everyone agreed. And the man who disagreed most was the one who had come back with 104 bullet holes in his aircraft. Rex Barber was not the kind of man who announced himself. He was quieter than Lanphier, less political, less inclined to self-promotion. But he had flown into the same sky, fired at the same targets, and come back with a plane so riddled with damage that ground crews stared at it in disbelief. Barber came back with 104 holes in his airplane, and he claimed the kill. Ground crewmen inspected the P-38 that Barber had borrowed for the mission. Lanphier had returned with only 2 bullet holes in his rudder. Contrast that to the 104 holes in Barber's plane, plus the knocked-out intercooler and the huge dent in his gondola. The physical evidence told a simple story. One pilot had been deep in the fight, absorbing fire from every angle, pressing his attack at treetop level. The other had returned with a nearly clean aircraft. One man's plane bore the scars of sustained combat at close range. The other's did not. Barber's account was steady and consistent. He had followed the lead bomber, the one flying closest to the jungle canopy. He had closed from behind. He had fired into its engines and fuselage. He had seen the left engine begin to smoke. The bomber had rolled violently. He had pulled away to avoid collision. Looking back, he saw the smoke column rising from where the Betty had gone in. His claim was not theatrical. It was mechanical. He described vectors. He described distances. He described what he saw, and critically, his description of attacking from behind the bomber would later prove consistent with the physical evidence found at the crash site. But in the spring of 1943, none of that analysis had been done. The war was still raging. There were more missions to fly, more enemies to engage, more men to bury. No one was conducting forensic reviews of bullet trajectories in the jungles of Bougainville. What Barber had was his testimony. What Lanphier had was momentum. And in the early weeks after the mission, momentum won. Barber arrived at the debriefing tent to find Lanphier already making the claim. The scene was set. 2 men, 2 stories, 1 kill, and an institution that would soon have to choose between them or find a way to avoid choosing at all. The trouble was, choosing meant investigating. And investigating meant asking questions that no one in wartime wanted to answer. The military needed a resolution, but what it wanted even more was silence. Operation Vengeance was classified. The code-breaking that made it possible was classified. The identity of the target was classified. Every layer of the mission was wrapped in secrecy, and any public dispute over credit threatened to unravel the entire thing. At first, intelligence evaluators thought that instead of 2 Japanese bombers over western Bougainville that day, there might have been 3. They credited Lanphier, Barber, and Holmes with 1 bomber kill each. 3 bombers, 3 kills, 3 satisfied pilots. It was a tidy solution. The only problem was that it was wrong. In the 1950s, Japanese records confirmed that only 2 bombers, rather than 3, had been shot down. Because Barber and Holmes had destroyed 1 bomber together, Barber and Lanphier could not have each shot down a bomber by themselves. The arithmetic no longer worked. Someone's claim had to give. In the 1970s, Air Force historians gathered documents to produce a listing of Army Air Force's aerial victories during World War II, attempting to assign credit consistently for all theaters. The resulting study, published in 1978, assigned official credit for shooting down Yamamoto's plane to both Lanphier and Barber. By then, Japanese evidence confirmed only 2 Bettys in the Yamamoto flight, one that went down on the island and the other in the sea. Reasoning that since both Lanphier and Barber claimed to have shot at a bomber that went down over the island, they should share credit. The record was revised to give each pilot half a credit, half a kill, a bureaucratic compromise. Neither man was satisfied. When Lanphier discovered that the Air Force was officially splitting credit, he was upset. He demanded that the Air Force reconsider the case and award him full credit. In March 1985, the Air Force reopened the matter, calling together a 6-person review board. The board's members were told to consider only the original evidence and no new evidence. This time the board concluded the evidence showed that both Lanphier and Barber had shot at and hit Yamamoto's plane at different times, and that therefore credit should remain split between them. Once again, each received half credit. The decision was pragmatic. It avoided calling either man a liar. It preserved unit cohesion, or what was left of it. But it resolved nothing. Both men walked away feeling the institution had failed them. Lanphier believed he deserved full credit. Barber believed the evidence clearly supported him alone. The split credit was meant to close a chapter. Instead, it opened a wound that would fester for decades. Because the question was never really about half a kill on a scorecard. It was about who would be remembered as the man who avenged Pearl Harbor. And that was not a question that bureaucracy could answer. The Americans were not the only ones with records. After the war, as archives opened and veterans spoke, the Japanese side of the story began to emerge. And what it revealed did not favor the narrative Thomas Lanphier had built. The crash site and body of Yamamoto were found on April 19th, the day after the attack, by a Japanese search and rescue party led by Army engineer Lieutenant Tsuyoshi Hamasuna. The crash site was located in the jungle north of Bougainville on Bougainville. The retrieval party noted Yamamoto had been thrown clear of the plane's wreckage, his white-gloved hand grasping the hilt of his katana, his body still upright in his seat under a tree. Hamasuna said Yamamoto was instantly recognizable, head tilted down as if deep in thought. A post-mortem indicated 2 bullet wounds, one to the back of his left shoulder and a separate wound to his left lower jaw that appeared to exit above his right eye. The Japanese Navy doctor examining the body determined that the head wound killed Yamamoto. Medical personnel determined that he was dead before the plane crashed. This was critical. The bullets that killed Yamamoto entered from behind him, from the back of his left shoulder, from the left side of his jaw. This was not the geometry of a side-on attack, which is what Lanphier described. The Japanese autopsy report showed the Admiral had been killed from bullets fired from his rear, consistent with Barber's account. A Japanese fighter pilot escorting the plane also noted that Yamamoto's bomber had been shot at from behind. The controversy did not subside after the war because of the testimony of the surviving Japanese escort pilot who witnessed the mission. Zero pilot Kenji Yanagiya, who had been in Yamamoto's fighter escort, provided his own account of what he saw. Japanese accounts showed no fighter losses on the mission, contradicting Lanphier's claim that he had shot down a 0 before turning to the bombers. Yanagiya affirmed that none of the escorting Japanese fighters were shot down, stating only one was damaged enough to require a half-day of repair. These details contradicted Lanphier's claim for a 0. Japanese military records confirmed only 2 Mitsubishi bombers had been shot down that day. Piece by piece, the Japanese evidence dismantled the framework of Lanphier's story. He had claimed a 0 kill. Japanese records showed no zeros were lost. He had claimed a side-angle attack on the bomber. The autopsy showed bullets entering from behind. He had described blowing off the right wing. The wreckage told a different story. There were no survivors in the airplane that crashed into the jungle, but 3 people survived in the bomber that crashed into the sea. Chief of Staff Ugaki survived the water landing, but Yamamoto's body lay in the jungle with the wreckage of his airplane. The Japanese records were not advocacy for either American pilot. They were simply the observations of the other side. But they happened to align, almost point by point, With what Rex Barber had said from the beginning, the jungle holds what men forget. Metal does not lie about the angle at which it was struck. Decades after the mission, investigators and historians returned to the crash site of Yamamoto's bomber. The wreckage still lay where it had fallen, swallowed by vegetation but not destroyed. Parts of the fuselage remained, sections of wing, torn aluminum that still bore the marks of .50 caliber rounds. Site inspections of the jungle crash site revealed that the path of the bullet impacts validated Barber's account because the damage was made by bullets entering from behind the bomber, as Barber asserted, and not from the right, as Lanphier stated. The physical evidence was unambiguous. The rounds that tore into Yamamoto's bomber came from directly behind it, not from a right-angle deflection shot, not from above, from behind. This was consistent with a pursuit attack, the kind Barber described, closing on the bomber's tail and firing into its engines and fuselage. Photos taken of the wreckage showed that the left wing had separated when it hit the trees, but the right wing was still on, the very wing that Lanphier said he had blown off. If Lanphier's version were true, the right wing should have been severed in the air. It was not. It was still attached to the fuselage, buckled only by the force of impact with the jungle canopy. A forensic examination was undertaken, noting that Yamamoto's Betty had taken severe damage just before hitting the jungle canopy, and that this destruction was caused by rear entry strikes. There was another test. A P-38, flown by investigating pilot Lefty Gardner, attempted to duplicate the maneuvers Lanphier claimed he had performed in order to reach Yamamoto's Betty. Gardner concluded it would have been impossible to have attacked the Zeros, and then dived 6,000 feet to destroy a target flying at treetop level within the time frame suggested. The physics did not work. Lanphier's account required him to engage fighters at altitude, reverse course, dive thousands of feet, acquire a target skimming the canopy, and fire a killing burst, all within seconds. The P-38 was fast, but it could not bend time. The sequence Lanphier described was, by the judgment of a qualified pilot flying the same aircraft, physically impossible. All the new evidence supported Barber's version of the kill, and none supported Lanphier's account. Yet the official record did not change. Half credit to Lanphier, half credit to Barber. The Air Force had made its decision. The Air Force would stand by it. And in the gap between evidence and bureaucracy, frustration grew like the jungle vines slowly consuming the wreckage of a Mitsubishi bomber on a hillside in Bougainville. Wars end, but some battles simply change terrain. After the guns fell silent in 1945, the dispute over who shot down Yamamoto migrated from debriefing tents to reunion halls, from military files to magazine articles, from quiet disagreements to public feuds. In spite of criticism from Barber and other surviving pilots, Lanphier continued to claim credit for downing Yamamoto until his death in 1987. Most newspaper obituaries reporting his death credited him with killing Yamamoto. Barber continued to contest Lanphier's claim, mainly in military circles and publications, until his own death in 2001. The controversy crackled at every reunion. Veteran Calvin Rudd recalled that the dispute came alive whenever the pilots held their annual gatherings. Old men who had once flown together, who had risked their lives in the same sky, found themselves divided by something that had happened in less than 60 seconds over a jungle they would never see again. 6 months after the mission, unauthorized details about the operation leaked into the press. In October 1943, an issue of Time magazine featured an article about vengeance and mentioned Lanphier by name. An outraged Navy considered it a serious breach of security. As a result, Major Mitchell, who had been nominated for the Medal of Honor, was downgraded to the Navy Cross. The leak damaged more than security. It cemented Lanphier's name in public consciousness. He was the man Time magazine had identified. He was the man the press celebrated. By the time Barber could mount a serious challenge, decades had passed, and the public narrative had calcified. Books appeared, documentaries aired, historians took sides. After Lanphier's death, the Second Yamamoto Mission Association was formed to advance Barber's cause. At the request of this organization, in March 1990, the Historical Research Center convened an independent advisory panel of combat pilots to review new evidence supporting Barber's claim. The panel affirmed that the evidence did not warrant a change and that shared credit remained appropriate. The institutional answer was always the same. The record stands. We have examined the evidence. We decline to alter the conclusion. The wall was bureaucratic, but it was impenetrable, and so the dispute became something larger than 2 pilots and 1 bomber. It became a case study in how military history is written, how credit is assigned, and how institutions protect their own decisions, even when the weight of evidence shifts beneath them. When the military would not move, Barber turned to the courts. Continuing his quest to receive sole credit, Barber filed a petition to change his military record with the Secretary of the Air Force. He petitioned the Air Force Board for correction of military records to have his half credit changed to whole credit. The Air Force ruled in 1991 that there was enough uncertainty in both claims for them to be accepted and ruled to let the shared credit stand. The language was careful. The Air Force did not say Barber was wrong. It said there was uncertainty. It said both claims had enough plausibility to coexist. It chose ambiguity over resolution. Barber did not accept this. He appealed to United States federal court, but it declined to intervene. In his appeal, Barber challenged the denial by the Secretary of the Air Force of his petition to correct his military record to reflect his sole credit for having shot down Yamamoto's bomber. He appealed the district court's summary judgment in favor of the Secretary. The court concluded that the Secretary's decision was not contrary to law, not arbitrary or capricious, and was supported by substantial evidence. It affirmed the judgment of the district court. The legal system offered no relief. The court did not evaluate who actually shot down the bomber. It evaluated only whether the Secretary of the Air Force had followed proper procedure in declining to change the record. The question before the judges was not one of historical truth. It was one of administrative law. Did the Secretary act within his authority? He did. Case closed. The court noted that contemporaneous combat records and later board decisions were entitled to considerable weight, especially after the passage of half a century. It also noted that Lanphier was no longer alive to make his case. Although the court had his writings, he was no longer there to testify. This was the cruelest irony. Lanphier had died in 1987, his version of events preserved in print and official records. He could not be cross-examined. He could not be challenged in a forum where truth was the standard rather than procedure. His story had been written in permanent ink while he was alive, and now that he was gone, the ink could not be erased. The court acknowledged that the entire operation was a triumph of intelligence and airmanship in planning and execution, and that glory should go to the team. That sentiment was noble, but it did not answer the question Barber had spent decades asking. It did not name the man behind the trigger. Rex Barber died on July 26, 2001. He was 78 years old. He had flown one of the most important fighter missions in American history. He had returned with over 100 holes in his aircraft. He had spent the second half of his life fighting a battle that no court and no review board would let him win. The official record remained unchanged. There is a reason kill claims in aerial combat are among the most disputed records in military history. The cockpit of a fighter aircraft is perhaps the worst possible vantage point from which to observe and remember what actually happened, At 300 miles per hour, events last fractions of seconds. A burst of fire, a flash of flame, a trail of smoke. The pilot is pulling G-forces, scanning for threats, managing fuel, watching his wingman, tracking his target, and trying not to die. The brain, under that kind of stress, does not record events like a camera. It constructs a narrative after the fact, stitching together fragments of perception into something that feels coherent. This is not dishonesty. It is neurology. Under extreme stress, the human brain compresses time, reorders events, and fills in gaps with plausible assumptions. Two pilots in the same engagement can honestly believe entirely different things happened because their brains processed the same chaos from different angles, at different moments, under different loads of fear and focus. In World War II, overclaiming was not the exception, it was the norm. Studies after the war found that across all air forces, kill claims routinely exceeded actual losses by factors of 2 or 3. Pilots were not lying. They were human. They saw what their eyes and adrenaline told them they saw. They reported it truthfully. But truth, in a spinning cockpit at 300 miles per hour with tracers flying, is a fragile thing. The Yamamoto mission compounded these problems. The engagement was brief. The altitude was low. The jungle canopy obscured the moment of impact. No gun cameras recorded the event. There were no impartial observers. The escort pilots were Japanese, and their testimony would not be available for decades. The American pilots were separated by distance, speed, and the chaos of simultaneous combat. In that environment, two men could fire at the same bomber moments apart, and each believe he had delivered the fatal blow. Both could be partially right. Both could be entirely sincere. And neither could prove his case beyond dispute, because the evidence that would settle the matter, film from gun cameras, had been deliberately left behind to save weight. The absence of that evidence was not negligence. It was a calculated decision. The mission's fuel margins were so thin that every ounce mattered. Gun cameras were heavy. They were removed. And in that removal, the possibility of a clean, indisputable resolution was removed with them. What remained was memory. Fallible, contested, emotionally charged memory. Two men went to their graves, certain of what they had done. The jungle kept the only physical record. And the institution that sent them both into the sky chose compromise over truth, because compromise was survivable, and truth, in a case like this, might not be. Japan learned of Yamamoto's death before the rest of the world, but it held the news in silence for more than a month. Yamamoto's death was not revealed until a month later, on May 21st. The impact of the loss was incalculable, and the Japanese nation mourned his passing. A state funeral was held in Tokyo on June 5th, with part of his ashes interred at the Tama Cemetery in Tokyo and at his ancestral home in Nagaoka. Yamamoto's remains were returned to Japan aboard the super battleship Musashi for a state funeral that drew 1 million mourners. The scale of the grief was itself a measure of the man's importance. Yamamoto had been more than a commander. He had been a symbol, the face of Japanese naval power, the mind behind the empire's greatest victories and its most audacious gamble. His death left a void that could not be filled by reassigning a title. After the admiral's death, Japan never again won a major battle in the Pacific War. Whether that was a direct consequence of his absence or simply a reflection of the war's inexorable trajectory is a question historians have debated ever since. Japan was losing the production war. It was losing the attrition war. It was losing the intelligence war. Yamamoto's death did not cause these trends, but it removed the one man who might have managed them with strategic creativity. For the Americans, the mission validated something profound. The intelligence gamble had worked. The codebreakers had delivered actionable intelligence. The planners had designed a feasible operation. The pilots had executed it with extraordinary precision. And the secret had held. The Japanese did not change their codes in the immediate aftermath. They did not suspect that JN-25 had been compromised. The event raised morale in the United States and shocked the Japanese. To cover the fact that the Allies were reading Japanese code, American news agencies were given the cover story that civilian coast watchers had observed Yamamoto boarding a bomber and relayed the information by radio. The cover story held long enough. The Japanese investigated the shoot-down, but attributed it to bad luck and lax security rather than compromised codes. The Allies continued to read JN-25 for months afterward, extracting intelligence that shaped operations across the Pacific. Operation Vengeance proved that signals intelligence could be weaponized with surgical precision, that a single decoded message could redirect the course of a war. It was a precursor to the targeted operations of later decades, a demonstration that knowing what the enemy planned was as powerful as any fleet or bomber wing. But it also demonstrated the cost of such operations. One American pilot never came home. The secrecy that made the mission possible also made honest accounting of it nearly impossible. And the very success of the operation created a prize, the credit for killing Yamamoto, that proved more divisive than any enemy action. In the end, Operation Vengeance was two stories at once. One was a story of brilliance, the other was a story of fracture. The brilliance was undeniable. 16 fighters flew nearly 1,000 miles. They navigated by dead reckoning across open ocean, arrived within 1 minute of the calculated intercept, engaged and destroyed both targets, and preserved the most important intelligence secret of the Pacific War. By any measure of planning, execution, and outcome, it was one of the most remarkable single missions in the history of air combat. But the fracture was equally real. Within hours of landing, the unity of the mission began to dissolve. 2 pilots claimed the same kill. The institution split the credit rather than resolve the dispute. The split satisfied no one. Books, boards, panels, and courts followed, each one failing to produce a definitive answer. Although Operation Vengeance was one of the most expertly executed missions in American Air Force history, the whole episode has subsequently been overshadowed by controversy over who actually shot down the Admiral's aircraft. This is the paradox. The mission itself was a model of teamwork. Codebreakers, intelligence officers, planners, ground crews, and pilots all performed their roles with extraordinary competence. No single person made it happen. It was the product of a system functioning at its absolute peak. But the reward structure demanded a name. Military culture, press culture, public memory, all these systems need a hero. They need a face. They need a single sentence. Who shot down Yamamoto? The question assumes that one person did. And in that assumption lies the seed of every dispute that followed. Institutions resist rewriting their own records for the same reason individuals resist admitting they were wrong. The cost of change is not just clerical, it is reputational. It calls into question the integrity of every prior decision. If the Air Force acknowledged that Barber alone shot down the bomber, it would have to explain why Lanphier was credited for decades. It would have to account for the review boards, the panels, the court filings. It would have to admit that the system failed. Easier to leave the record as it was. Half and half. A bureaucratic solution to a human problem. And in doing so, the institution preserved its own consistency at the expense of one man's legacy. Pilot Julius Jacobson, who flew the mission, reflected years later on the dispute. Fellow veteran Rice commented that historians, fighter pilots, and all who studied the record would forever speculate as to the exact events, and that there was glory for the whole team. There was glory for the whole team? That much is true. But there was also a specific trigger, a specific burst, a specific angle of fire. And for the man who delivered it, half credit felt like half the truth. 80 years have passed since a Mitsubishi bomber fell into the jungle of Bougainville. The wreckage is still there. The remains of Yamamoto's aircraft lie in the jungle around 9 miles from the town of Panguna. The crash site is around an hour's walk from the nearest road. Although the wreckage has been heavily scavenged by souvenir hunters, parts of the fuselage remain where it crashed. The jungle has done what institutions could not. It has absorbed the evidence into itself, slowly dissolving the metal, pulling the wreckage into the soil, erasing the sharp edges of what happened on a Palm Sunday morning in April 1943. Operation Vengeance endures as one of the most precisely executed combat missions in American military history. The code breakers, the navigators, the pilots, all of them performed at the edge of what was possible. They flew beyond their fuel margins, beyond their tactical doctrine, beyond any reasonable expectation of success. And they succeeded. The pilot who the Air Force would ultimately give credit to, many years later, for shooting down Yamamoto's plane, Rex Barber, came back with 104 holes in his aircraft. Thomas Lanphier also claimed to have shot Yamamoto down, resulting in a decades-long dispute. When the Air Force finally sided with Barber, Lanphier lost his ace status as he reverted to 4 kills. But even that late acknowledgement came wrapped in qualifications. The official half-credit ruling was never formally reversed by the Air Force Board for correction of military records. The legal case was decided on procedural grounds, not evidentiary ones. The most recent analysis holds that Barber shot down the lead bomber carrying Yamamoto, not Lanphier. But the institutional record remains what it was, a compromise designed to contain a dispute, not resolve it. Thomas Lanphier died in 1987. Rex Barber died in 2001. Major John Mitchell, who navigated 16 fighters across 400 miles of ocean to arrive within 60 seconds of the intercept, lived until 2003. One by one, the men who flew the mission have all gone silent. Their arguments, their frustrations, their memories of that brief sky above Bougainville, all of it now belongs to history. And history, in its way, has chosen. Not through a board ruling or a court decision, but through the accumulation of evidence, the bullet holes entering from behind, the right wing still attached, the autopsy showing wounds from the rear, the Japanese escort pilot's testimony, the failed attempt to replicate Lanphier's claimed maneuvers. The evidence speaks with a consistency that no review board was willing to formalize. But perhaps the deeper lesson lies not in who pulled the trigger, but in what happened afterward. 16 men flew one of the most daring missions of the war. One of them never came home. The rest returned to Guadalcanal, where the jungle rotted everything and the heat never broke, and began a different kind of war, one fought with words, records, petitions, and pride. The mission itself was a triumph of teamwork. The aftermath was a study in the limits of recognition. In war, victories are shared by thousands, but credit, by its nature, flows toward one name, one face, one story. And when 2 men reach for the same recognition, the institution must choose. Or, as it did here, refuse to choose, and let time carry the question until no one is left to answer it. Is it enough that the mission succeeded? Is it enough that the architect of Pearl Harbor fell from the sky and never rose again? Or does history demand a single name, a single hand on the trigger, a single line in the ledger? The jungle of Bougainville does not answer. The wreckage rusts quietly in the undergrowth. The men are gone. The argument endures. And perhaps that is the truest thing about war. Victory can be total, but the story of who earned it is never finished.